So good evening. My name is Wendy Molteni. I am with the League of Women Voters of Utah, and I am joined tonight by Professor Leah A. Murray, a Brady Presidential Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Philosophy and Academic Director of the Walker Institute of Politics and Public Service at Weber State University. Thank you for joining us tonight. So, Professor, the legislature drew maps in November. Sorry, I have a bunny. She just jumped. The legislature drew new maps in November for redistricting, but that isn't the end of the process. What happens after the maps are drawn?
Yeah, so what happens after the maps are drawn? So what I understand from taking a look on Ballotpedia, so I was looking to kind of see where it is, that's Governor Cox signed them into office, or he approved them on November 16th. So the next step, I think, could be litigation if people are challenging what happens with those districts. But basically, as far as Governor Cox is concerned, those seats are going to be used in this legislative election cycle.
Great. Do we know how and when people can find out what their new districts are?
So that's an interesting question. When I'm looking at the links on the website, so I have pulled up, the Utah Legislative Redistricting Committee links. I'm looking at them. So I think people, and I could throw in the chat, where I'm finding those links. So I think people could look now to see what that looks like. Does that make sense? So, yeah. So this one right here, for example, is the state school board. So people could hop on and see what their districts are. And I'll put in the chat each one so that people can just, if they're sitting on their computer right now, want to take a second, they can take a look at their districts at the moment.
Great. And also my understanding is that the counties are looking at these maps right now. And so if there's any cleanup that needs to be done, I think there's going to be a cleanup bill passed during the legislative session.
That is correct. They were in special session when they passed this, right? So that's why it was November. And they will take a look at it again. There are elections officials in the counties that take a look at the districts and make sure they make sense, right? Because the elections officials inside the counties know better than anyone else where the precincts are and what those districts look like. So that'll be a run through. And then I'm sure the general, the real session will take a look at it. Yeah.
Excellent. And then after that, do you think the Lieutenant Governor's website will have the final precincts on them?
Yeah, that is correct. So the state of Utah uses the Lieutenant Governor's office to run its elections. Most states in the country use the Secretary of State. So if you were looking at another state, 47 of them will be the Secretary of State that does that, but we use the Lieutenant Governor. And so once it's settled, that office then takes over the implementation of what happens in those districts.
Why are we different from 47 other states?
Because just kind of the nature of where we house elections implementation in our state. So it's just a quirk of our Constitution, that goes back to when we wrote it. So most states use the Secretary of State to do this, and the Lieutenant Governor has a little more kind of like the vice president ceremonial, job that they do. But I think Utah puts more, hey, you're here and you're being paid, you should do some work in their Lieutenant Governor's office. So I'm not sure it's a bad thing or that it signals something hugely different. I just think it's a quirk of where we decided to put authority in our titles.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
So looking at the new state House map, what are some of the big picture changes that occurred?
When we look at the House map, so on this one, so I'm trying to grab real quick which one when we look at the House map, which was the last one I put in the chat, so if anyone wanted to look at it with me, it is the last one down there. Not huge changes. So what you see is some of these districts, they deviate a little bit from last time. Does that make sense? But there weren't necessarily, and again, we chatted before, Wendy, I'm not a geographer, so I want to be really careful when a geographer could say to you, oh, now it runs along this fault or what, you know what I mean? But I don't see any major changes or huge differences inside of these districts. So
great. Could you highlight some of the districts where incumbents ended up in the same district for the House?
Oh, I can't do that for you. I'm so sorry. Yeah, so I would have to do a little bit quick looking to see where that happened. So I was aware of buzz around it, but I can't say to you House 10 like redistricted someone. And I didn't catch any stories that said people were retiring or resigning as a result. Does that make sense? I'm not real clear of it right off the top of my head politically. But you know, the deal is it's a Republican legislature. All of the Democrats voted against it, like these seats. So if any redistricting happened, you know that it's going to benefit the Republican Party. And generally the rule on redistricting is you draw your districts in such a way to make it harder for the opposition. And that's not just true in Utah, that's true across the country whenever humans draw districts, like they're doing it in such a way to help hurt the opposition, if that makes sense. So I think you could be pretty sure that if someone was having incumbents run against each other, it would be Democrats that was happening to. The other thing that I did hear was because of the census population boom happened south of where I live, right? So I'm up in Weber County. There was some concern of how the districts up here, right, might be running some Republicans against each other because we lost power. Does that make sense? Like it moved south. But again, I didn't hear any follow-up after November that anyone was in trouble. So I'm not sure that those concerns panned out.
Okay, great. Not a question that I had asked you ahead of time, but during the redistricting process, there were a lot of legislators, especially because you're in Weber County, that said Weber County is carved up into 6 different districts. And so that gives Weber County a bigger voice, even though Weber County could have 1 or 2 representatives. Do you think that that is a true statement, that it's better to have people representing Weber and maybe Davis and Weber Box Elder combined, that you get more of a voice in Weber County?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I do not, but it's hard. Okay. So I want to be clear about this, right? Like, so when we think about our political districts, when we do geographic districts for everything that we're doing that we're electing, one of our natural political districts is a county, and states use county to implement, right? So, counties don't have independent power. They are not sovereign, right? So it's not the same relationship like states to the federal government. Counties are subsets of the state. They do whatever the state tells them, and they are used for implementation purposes only. Previous to the 1960s, most of our state legislatures would have had counties as also a geographic unit for election. So you'd like vote for the state Senate, a senator from Weber County. Then that kind of matches what we do at the national level, right? With like states each get 2 senators. What happens in the 1960s is the Supreme Court rules that 1 person has to equal 1 vote when you are drawing districts. So all that kind of bubbles down into our states, and you cannot have 1 county having 1 senator. When you have counties like Weber County and you have counties like, you know, Carbon County, right? Okay, so we think about the number, and I'm just picking on a couple, right? But we think about the number of people in Salt Lake County and compare that to the number of people in San Juan County. If I have 1 senator from each, then San Juan County is very much overrepresented. What we know at the national level is that happens with our United States Senate, but that's a constitutional quirk of giving states political equality. And so that ruling of 1 person, 1 vote by the Supreme Court doesn't affect our United States Senate, but affects all of the state legislatures. To a certain extent, we really don't need bicameral And what I mean by bicameral is we don't really need 2 chambers in state legislatures anymore. Because to be fair, if you are applying the 1 person, 1 vote principle, then counties to a certain extent cease to be relevant when it comes to political representation. They're still very important for implementation of services, which we all know because of like COVID, right? Like, so you're like, you gotta have departments of health, you gotta have, you know, them doing that job. But in terms of voting, if a rule is coming down that says you can't have 1 elected official from 1 county that has a much smaller number of people than from another county. All right. So all that being true, that is good for urban counties because it means they should get more representation, because the higher your population density, the more representatives you should have. But I think, so how do I say this? I don't necessarily buy that it helps or hurts Weber County to have overlapping districts with other counties, because I don't think that's that's not the reason the lines are drawn the way they are. They're drawn the way they are because we have to have relatively equal numbers of people, right? So when we're looking at these districts, when we look at the Senate, they all have about 110,000 people, right? So you're taking the state, dividing our couple million people up by a number, you get 110,000 people. And, you know, like they're going to lay out over those counties the way that they lay out, given the rules of how we do districting. So, so I don't think that it's false or true. I think it's the wrong question. Does that make sense? So like Weber County isn't better represented or worse represented because it has more representatives. We have this many House members and we have this many senators because we have this many people, and you have no choice about how you're trying to draw those lines. So if that makes sense.
Yep, absolutely. No, and that was just brought up a lot by citizens that they'd like to see county lines maintained as wholly as they could, if possible.
Yeah, no, that's a really it's so interesting, right? So when we are looking, and we're talking about state legislature, right? But you can also talk about congressional districts as well, right? What happens is when you add the rules that the Supreme Court gave us, which is 1 person, 1 vote, you know, another fun rule that the Supreme Court gave us is it has to be compact. Compact is a really hard rule. The most compact thing that you can have is a circle, but none of us live, this sounds so stupid to say this out loud, but like none of us live in a circle, if that makes sense, right? So you can't actually draw a perfectly compact district. And the other rule we have is like they have to be contiguous. So what that means is I can't do donuts, right? So I can have beautifully compact districts like circles, but I can't put circles inside of circles because I have to make sure that the district lines run contiguously. Like it has to be all connected like some kind of weird polygram, right? So polygon, right? So it's tricky when we think about where the lines go. Once you have added those rules of 1 person, 1 vote, of all points in a district have to be contained within a single boundary. So that's contiguous, right? They've all got to be, you know, the line has to be all together, and they have to be compact, which is as tightly as possible. You're never going to catch county lines. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it'd be really difficult to find natural boundaries that make sense. So, for example, the state of California uses a commission to draw their districts, and the commission is told to, it has to be communities of interest. Okay, so that the state of California, which is huge and has like, you know, many, many millions of people, they're trying to figure out where the communities of interest are. So they didn't even do counties. They were like, go out and find communities. Well, then it's a whole conversation over like, what is a community? Does that make sense? Like, is that a religious community? Is that people who live in this neighborhood? Is it that, right? And up and down California were these huge battles, and it wasn't even a state legislature. They thought they had depoliticized it because they pulled it out, gave it to an independent commission who are desperately trying to find community, right? And they're going to draw lines around these communities. So anyway, to a certain extent, the county lines are arbitrary boundaries, right? Like a state legislature drew lines around Weber County and said, here's Weber County, or here's Box Elder County, or whatever. And those arbitrary lines, humans don't migrate that way. Does that make sense? So it's not like 110,000 of us go and live in a circle, right? So again, I don't mean to, I mean, I think people think about counties, and I think they think about communities, and I think they think everyone who lives on this side of the street should be, you know what I mean? But once you start adding the rules that the Supreme Court gave us 50 years ago, it gets really difficult to even care about those lines, because what you are looking for is 110,000 people that I can put in a compact, contiguous polygon, so that I don't get sued. If that, you know what I mean? So, so to a certain extent, I don't want to say I just don't, it's a lot of conversation about something that doesn't matter given what the rules are from our Supreme Court.
Right.
Makes sense. Yeah.
No, that does make sense. And so there's a lot of discussion from Salt Lake County residents that they would like to see a donut hole. And you're saying that that's just not possible given the rules. Correct.
That is correct. And again, and it's really like, I laugh a little bit this, and I'm not like laughing, right? So I want to be clear as I say this. We are not even the worst state in the union for these issues, right? So we talk about this a lot, and we are super frustrated about things. But if I could show you like a map of gerrymandering at the congressional level, we're bad, but we're not even close to being the worst. Does that make sense? So we don't pop in like the top 10 of just ridiculousness that is happening. The states that pop as the most ridiculous are many states in the South. North Carolina, Maryland are just tied for being, I mean, the shapes they draw are insane. And there's a lovely interview with the man from North Carolina, because they get sued all the time. And their districts are always being litigated. And this lovely man being interviewed was like, just tell me what you want, right? And then I will just do it, because they're like exhausted. But yeah, the donut holes are not allowed, right? So what seems totally reasonable is not constitutionally allowable. And so a lot of states just run into those rules as they're trying to have these conversations. So interesting.
Yeah, and I went to a conference of state legislators around redistricting, and there's 141 redistrictings that need to happen in the country, and there's like 242 lawsuits around redistricting. So two lawsuits on average per redistrict. So
yeah, and the thing that's tricky is, and you haven't even asked this question, but the thing that's tricky is people get very frustrated by gerrymandering, right? And what gerrymandering is drawing a district with a political outcome in mind. So gerrymandering could be, I'm going to draw this district to guarantee the incumbent loses. So you actually see state legislatures going, I'm going to get rid of this person. They'll draw a line. I could gerrymander to guarantee a political party loses. I could gerrymander to try to boost, and we call these minority majority districts, to try to boost a particular underrepresented group. Does that make sense? So one of the things that happened in North Carolina was they drew a district in an effort to try to guarantee a Black representative to the United States House. And the Supreme Court ruled you can't do it for race, right? So they were kind of like, you can gerrymander for a whole host of things, but given other litigation around race and equality, you cannot gerrymander around race. All right, so now I can't do that, right? So as I start to get into this, I can hurt incumbents and I can hurt parties, but I cannot help or hurt race or ethnicity. Does that make sense? So I can't draw with that. So what happens with litigation oftentimes is I'm going to litigate if there is some harm that I can see. And again, harm is really tricky to talk about because it's hard to predict to a degree of certainty that I actually caused an outcome. Now, look, we all look at stuff and we're like, we know exactly why it's districted this way, and we know what we're expecting. But it's really hard to kind of go, here's the actual harm that's going to happen, right? Like, so one fewer Democrat or one more Republican, you know what I mean? Like that. So what happens is those litigation, they often falter when it has to do with trying to prove that harm, right? So the courts are like, you have to actually prove harm is happening. That's really difficult to do. The thing that is tricky in districts is this, we just talked about it. If I can say you're gerrymandering to hurt race, it's going to get knocked, right? So that litigation is going to happen right away. But if most Black voters in Georgia vote Democratic, okay, now you can see the problem. I'm going to go, no, I gerrymander to get rid of the Democratic Party in Georgia. And the court's going to go, well, that's okay. So now litigation's got to kind of prove it's not about the party, it's about the race. Do you see that? Right. Anyway, so yeah, there's always a ton of litigation after the districts get drawn. And that's also from the 1960s. So the Voting Rights Act basically said to the country, you need to stop the hijinks, right? So you've got the Supreme Court ruling, stop the hijinks on one man, well, they said one man, I say one person, one vote, compactness and contiguity. And then you've got the Voting Rights Act saying, stop the hijinks around race, around language. Does that make sense? So they kind of write in these rules. And then what the Voting Rights Act says is you can bring a lawsuit, if that makes sense, right? So people who feel harmed can sue, and that's why you get, 2 lawsuits per district across the country, right? 2 lawsuits per redistricting across the country. Yeah.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. So looking at getting back to Utah.
Okay.
Looking at the state Senate maps, was there any big picture changes that happened with the state Senate?
Again, when I'm looking at it, and so to be fair, right, not anything that I caught. Does that make sense, or that I was aware of? And like I said, I'm not a GIS expert, so I apologize. I can't go, oh, this totally moved in this way. But again, when you're looking at these and they're talking about where they moved people, I didn't see huge changes. But they're different from the commission. Does that make sense? So what the state legislature drew was very much different from the drafts when you're on the website looking at what the commission wanted. So my, suspicion is maybe the wrong way to say it, but I got to think there's stuff in there that I'm just missing because I don't know the district super well. Does that make sense? Or I'm not sure where the communities of interest are. And the commission did its work, right? It traveled the state, it talked to all the people, it talked, and again, people would have said, we want county lines, and commissioners would have said, we can't do that for all the things that I just said. But the fact that they had different district drawings, means there's probably some, politics involved that I'm unaware of because I wasn't in the room when it happened. And I don't know the players well enough to be sure, if that makes sense. So I apologize for.
Well, and I guess that's the other question that everybody still has is who was in the room when these maps were drawn?
Right. And the answer is the Legislative Redistricting Committee, which absolutely is a Republican dominated, group of people. So, and I'm sorry, I went to Hamilton this week, so I've got like Hamilton on the brain in the room where it happened. So how that sausage was made absolutely was done by Republicans. And the fact that all the Democrats voted against it means they did not think it was fair. Whether it was fair by the rules that we have to play by, do you hear what I'm trying to say, is a different question. And I think probably it will be found that it is fair, but I don't think Democrats and groups in the state are going to agree.
Okay, fair enough. So the next question that I have is, I'm not sure that I'm going to phrase this correctly. In the Senate, terms are staggered, and so there's some consistency between representation.
Correct.
In districts where 2 incumbents with existing terms of different lengths end up getting put in the same district, when does that term end? Is it like every odd number of district has a certain end date and every even has a different number? And so if you were put together, it's just determined by the district number?
That is a really good question, and I don't know the answer. I'm so sorry that I don't know that answer. I think, so if I've got 2 incumbents running against each other, and I think the answer is going to be whenever the term of this election ends, and the person who you're like, it's a reboot is my assumption, but let me be clear. When we start doing different elections, if that makes sense, is we would be doing special elections, but that's usually as a result of a term being filled. Do you know what I mean? Like someone passes away and then you're filling that term. But I think right now, whoever comes in, if you were an incumbent, there was no guarantee to be there, right? It's not a term like a judge where you have it for this, you have it till the next election. So I think it's going to be a reboot. But I want to be cautious about, I'm not 100% sure on that answer. I think that's the answer, but I'm not 100%.
Okay, thank you. So there's been a lot of talk in the past year, especially 2 years, I guess we're at 2 years now, about school boards.
Yeah.
So looking at the school board map, do you see any significant changes there?
You know, there were bigger moves. Does that make sense? So when you're looking at the school board map, one of the columns tells you deviation. Does that make sense? So they're kind of like where they've moved people. And there were bigger numbers on this one than there were in the House and the Senate. Does that make sense? Which means there's bigger numbers here. But I'm not clear enough to know why that happened. And when I was searching to figure out answers, didn't find answers. Does that make sense? So no one was talking about like what was going on in those districts. So yeah, I don't know the answer. So I see change, and there's more change here. I do think with the school board, there's more politics around that right now. Not that it's not sexy about the legislature, does that make sense? But the school board and the way that they're getting on that board, right? How they're managing things is a little bit different. So I'm wondering if there was more change and volatility there as a result of those more recent changes about making it partisan, you know, like those things that were happening in our state. But I'm not 100%.
How do you think school board seats now being partisan has changed how the board conducts business compared to when those seats were nonpartisan?
Oh, well, it changes everything, doesn't it? You know, so what happens is once you make it partisan, now the school board members have an obligation to answer to a party platform, which just changes the way, yeah, like it changes your parameters of what is possible. So if I am nonpartisan and no one is saying, here's a party platform that I'm now going to be held accountable to, you know what I mean, during like a convention or right in some kind of questioning of me, then I probably have more latitude and room to move. So to give you an example of this at the national level, the United States Senate used to be chosen by state legislatures, and that was true until the early 20th century. Once they started getting chosen by people, all of the policy questions shifted, and what they talked about shifted, and the positions they pushed shifted, and the United States Senate really started to look much more like the United States House as a result. That is just what it is, right? So when you change the method of selecting people, the representation and what the degrees of freedom they have, the room that they have to move changes. So, and I'm disappointed that it's partisan. So I'll just, you didn't ask me that, but I will just say, because I don't think education, you know, it's a public service and it's as old as this country having public education. And I'm concerned about conflating issues of education with the partisan polarization that's so rampant in our country right now, if that makes sense. So I am worried about it. Like, you know, yeah.
Is there a standard across other states of how school boards are appointed or elected?
No, it's all over the map. Generally, it's nonpartisan. A number of states, it's not even during a general election cycle. So in a lot of places, you're voting for the school board in like March. So they'll do like a school board election at the same time as like a bond, or they're approving their budget and they kind of do it early. But no, it is all over the map. So some places it's partisan, some places it's not. I like how you asked if it's appointed. It's usually you'll have appointments at kind of commission levels. Does that make sense? Like in state levels, local levels are usually mostly elected. But again, it's all over the place.
Well, because I think I've heard that there's going to be something proposed to have the governor appoint the school board.
Yeah. And now, so that's an interesting conversation, right? So what that does when we think about, so how do I explain this? And again, I've got Hamilton on the brain because I just saw Hamilton, right? Alexander Hamilton's argument was we should have public service be as professional as possible. So he would argue it should be appointed in the executive branch because it's implementing, and implementation happens in the executive branch. So Hamilton would say, yeah, Cox should appoint anybody who is implementing any public service, right? And to a certain extent, the federal government kind of operates that way. So if you think about our Department of Education at the national level, President Biden appointed, it gets confirmed by the Senate, and nobody votes for them, right? Like that is, and that is Hamilton's idea of trying to professionalize who is implementing policy as much as possible. That is also a very elite way of governing, and it's not very small d democratic. So if I am more of a believer in democracy, then my answer is I want everybody elected because I want every person who makes a decision answering to the American people and being held accountable to them. That is much more Jeffersonian. Does that make sense? We go all the way back to the founding. This conversation's been around for a while. And it's very much embraced by Andrew Jackson in the mid 1800s, where to the victor goes the spoils. If I get elected, right, like I get to fire everybody who is here and we start over. And this country kind of flirts with this, right? So we have civil service at the federal level, like 80 to 90% of our people who work for government have to pass an exam. So it's merit-based, it is not appointment-based. But the top of the pyramid is all appointment-based, but none of it's elected, right? Inside of states, we do a lot more electing. Does that make sense? So we tend to see more democracy, if you will, inside of states. And so that question is whether you think accountability matters more or whether you think like stable policy implementation matters more, right? So if you are arguing that Governor Cox should be appointing, what you're arguing for is more elite expertise. If you are arguing for more elections, and what you're arguing for is more democracy. Yeah, if that makes sense. And to a certain extent, those are both value positive, right? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's just kind of, what is it that we're looking for?
So based on the fact that we're in kind of a populist swing in the country right now, do you suspect that that push to have the governor appoint school board members is not going anywhere?
I think if people are paying attention, right? Okay, so yes, I love how you just asked that. So populist swing, and what we have is people being sure, A, that the government shouldn't be trusted and shouldn't be telling us to do anything, which comes down to departments of health, right? And whether we should wear masks, and the conversation right now about the mask mandate in Salt Lake County and Weber County was kind of like, maybe thinking about a mask mandate, right? And people going, how dare you tell me what to do with my face, right? I don't care if there's a pandemic, I'll do what I want. That vibe, which isn't caused by COVID, what we're seeing in response to COVID is, been around for a bit. Does that make sense? So like that populist vibe has been around for about a decade. And it's not just our country, it's across the world, this kind of real populist streak, which includes a lack of respect and a lack of trust for expertise, would lead me to suggest that the move's going to be Governor Cox doesn't get to do that. Does that make sense? That we would want to keep it more in the control of the elections? Yeah.
Yep, that makes sense. So sticking with school board, during public testimony, anyone who spoke about school board maps in both the Independent Commission and the Legislative Committee, everybody requested that their school district be kept as whole as possible. Then on the floor of the House, moments before the new map passed, Representative Ward said that the proposed map met the goal of having each board member represent at least 2 school districts. What was the legislature thinking, since this runs completely counter to what the public and the UEA asked for?
Yeah, so the answer is they didn't care what the public or what the UEA asked for. But again, and I hate saying that so flippantly the way I just said that, but the answer, like the legit answer is the legislature, given the rules that it has, does that make sense? Like, and it has to make these districts with all the rules that come down when you are drawing any district that are geographic units for politics. Basically, they had a different set of expectations in mind than did the people, right? So they're going to say, we have a state school board that is making decisions about education. They are going to be around a long time, right? We are only in office for 45 days. I mean, they're in office, but we're only around for 45 days. And we are going to exert as much control over what they are able to do, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? So they're going to design it in a way that benefits them. And I don't want to say they don't care about people, because, oh my gosh, I don't mean to say that. But I think what they're thinking is, from our point of view, we need a school board, right, that is working for us. And the UEA's point of view is we want a school board working for teachers, right? Like, you know what I mean? And then public comment is, I want a school board working for me. So what you have are three different sets of stakeholders. So what were they thinking? That's what they were thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like that goes along with the legislature really trying to check the governor's powers, that the legislature wants to be the ones in charge of everything as much as they can.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, like, when we think about, again, like the founding of this country, there's this beautiful quote from Madison where he's like, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. And if angels were in government, we wouldn't have to worry about it. And Madison's like, but as it turns out, there are no angels anywhere. So we are really, we should just really be suspicious of everybody all the time. It's not a great view of human nature, but you build into the system ambition counteracting ambition. So absolutely, the governor wants the most power. The state legislature wants the most power. Courts do too. They just pretend they don't, but they do, right? Like they want to be in charge. But yeah, and I think, so what's really interesting, and again, education, all these places where it's public service, whether it's education or whether it's like police departments, right? Like policing, or health departments managing COVID, all of that is in the purview of the executive branch to do the work because they are implementing things. And COVID just drove home, right? That whole thing broke after the legislature left that year, right? So Governor Herbert was like, well, it's my job, right? And I'm the only one who's still working and I'm going to implement all this stuff. And the state legislature was like, what? Blah, 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 blah. You know what I mean? So they come back in and they start passing rules in an effort to take control. You're absolutely right.
And they can justify that by saying that they're the most accountable to the people. Does that strike you as true?
I think it is true. Well, I don't want to say they're the most accountable because the governor is also elected, but they're definitely more accountable than any appointed officials or any official who is hired based on merit rather than elected, right? So accountability goes along with electorability, right? Like, so if I elected you, then you are absolutely accountable to me. So the legislature is going to say they're the people's branch, and they are, because everybody in there has been elected in a way that teachers are not. Do you hear what I'm trying to say? Like, or the health, Angela Dunn was not elected, right? So I'm picking on Angela Dunn because I'm thinking about COVID, but like any of those kind of officials that are absolutely governing officials and are making decisions with regard to the public good are not as accountable to the people as the legislators are as the legislature is. So I think they're right, but I'm not sure that necessarily is the right reason for them to be in charge, right? Like, so what Hamilton would say is, yeah, you're the most accountable and people are crazy. So what we need in the executive branch is some distance from people so we can have good governance, right? So he would have argued, good Lord, in a public health pandemic, we need the executive branch being in charge. You know what I mean? Like, so you'll see him making that argument it's an easier argument for him to make because George Washington was his president and he's much cooler, than Governor Cox, right? But the principles and the concepts still apply, right? So the argument out of the executive branch could be, we have distance from the people and that's a good thing, right? And what we're doing is appointing experts and that's a good thing. And there's some value in governance to not be as democratically accountable. But I think the legislature making the argument that they're the most accountable is true. I'm just not sure it's the right answer on issues around education. Does that make sense? And,
yeah.
And the choices they're making. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So shifting to the congressional map. There's already been a lot said about the congressional map. Can't do a donut hole. But could you summarize the changes that have been made with this new map?
Yeah, so when I'm looking at this map, and I know this one a little bit better because I do federal politics more than I do state and local. Again, so when you're looking at it, they're doing all the same things that we talked about. They're landing at 817,000 people per district, which makes it hard, okay? Because they're trying to figure that out. However, you could find 817,000 people with a Democratic majority in this state, right? So you could draw a district in such a way that a Democrat could take one of the seats. What I see in these is the shoring up of that never happening, right? So what you're gonna do is move the Ben McAdams district in such a way to make it harder for a Democrat to win. So when we think about this, right? So let's just we can talk about Utah very specifically. What we know is that Republicans pick up House seats more than their vote share in the country. So what that means is 435 House seats, Republicans versus Democrats, just like what percentages come out to vote, the Democrats should have 11 more seats. Okay, so the Republicans overperform by 11 seats as a result of the 2020 round. We'll see what happens with 2020. Does that make sense? We'll have to, again, it's hard to predict. We won't really know. Have me back next year and we'll say, this is where it was. But what they do is they overperform. So you draw the districts in such a way to guarantee an outcome. And you can do this by cracking or packing. All right, so packing is when you take all the people. And I was talking earlier about majority minority districts, and what North Carolina did was packed all the Black voters into a district to try to get a Black House member. The Supreme Court said you can't do it because of race, and then North Carolina. So even in that was kind of maybe a good intention. Does that make sense? But you couldn't do it like that. So you can pack. So what Utah did in the 1990s, so they would pack all the Democrats into one seat. So they basically go, there's your seat. You get that one, right? Like the rest of the state, we've drawn in such a way, that has the rural areas and the Republicans, but we're giving kind of like Salt Lake County, Summit County, their seat, and those Democrats get to have their person. In 2000, after that, they redistricted. And what they did was they cracked the Democratic power base. So what you do is draw through those areas where the Democrats are, and you crack them to dilute their power. So that happened in the 2000 redistrict. It happened in the 2010. 2000, we still had Matheson, but that was because he was an incumbent, and incumbency has a lot of advantage, and he almost lost twice. So even though he wasn't incumbent and very well resourced, he almost lost due to that cracking. And then in the 2010, like the aughts, Ben McAdams was able to win, for a whole host of reasons. And the Republican Party basically was like, we're going to make sure that doesn't happen again. So they better cracked the Democratic power base in the center of the state. Right. So that's totally what you see happening with those districts. Yeah.
So Representative Ward said, as they were passing this congressional map, that he was concerned about making that district less competitive and seeing that as a trend nationwide for having less competitive districts. So what does that mean for democracy?
Sure. Oh, wow. That's a great question. So the answer is there are so I told you 435 seats in the House, 40 of them are competitive, maybe. Really? And that is like being super generous about competitiveness. Competition is not just due to redistricting, although redistricting and gerrymandering is a huge part of it. Competition is also due to the fact that we don't like to run against people. So smart politics means I don't challenge a popular incumbent, right? So if someone is popular and is doing well, I'm not going to get a good challenger. So actually the biggest reason why we have a lack of competition in almost 400 seats in our country is mostly due to lack of challenger quality, which sounds really mean, but it's just legit. Because if I am someone who wants to run, I wait for an open seat. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? Like, so I'm not going to launch generally against a Mike Lee. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just not. It's an incumbent. It's really hard, well-resourced. I'm going to wait for that open seat. Think Mitt Romney with Orrin Hatch, right? Like, I'm going to wait for that seat to come open. So what happens is it's a lot of it's due to that kind of factor where we don't get good quality challengers. A lot of it is due to our incumbents staying for a really long time. So it used to be the case that they cycled out more quickly, not always, but more, and more of our incumbents stay for a lot longer, right? So that kind of compounds with the lack of quality challengers with our incumbents being there for a really long time. The other thing that's happening with competition, and this is what the representative was talking about, is Americans live more near people who are like them than they used to. So we have a lot more of the case that urban areas are much more Democrat and rural areas are much more Republican, and we don't see, we call that sorting. That's like, so like, and I want to be clear, it's not that people move and go, I'm a Democrat, I'm going to move to Salt Lake City. Like, people move and they migrate for a whole host of reasons. But the reasons that they're choosing, Democrats tend to self-select cities, Republicans tend to self-select something else. The only place where you have competition is in the suburbs. So any districts that are running over suburbs or have more suburbs in their area get a lot more competition. So another interesting dynamic, which is really not the district's fault, is just kind of where people live and who they live near. And so as you're drawing this compact, contiguous, 817,000 districts, you're getting a lot of Democrats living near each other. Does that make sense? And
yeah.
So, okay. But absolutely correct that redistricting does cause districts to be less competitive. And that is a problem for democracy if we feel like competition's a good thing. So I say that because we've had a really competitive decade of politics and all of us are kind of exhausted. So to a certain extent, you're like, yeah, I've been making this argument. This is very good for democracy. Everyone's very loud. Everyone's yelling all the time. Everyone's really paying attention. Woo! But also, we're all like really tired of politics. Yeah. So don't get me wrong. So it is a bad thing for democracy, but is a good thing in other ways. Kind of having maybe some more stable districts maybe helps us not be as crazy in politics. But that's just an interesting kind of trade-off, I think, there. But when we're thinking about competitiveness, so I was talking about California, North Carolina, we could pick on Arizona. So Arizona, basically in the last 2010, they get a commission. So they decide to depoliticize it. They give it to a commission and they say to the commission, you have to draw competitive seats. so they went out and gerrymandered away from Republicans. So what happened was that state had overrepresented Republicans in their districts. They get forced to draw competitive seats. And so Democrats start to win. And Arizona is now one of the most politically hot places in the country. So absolutely the way you draw districts can affect that. Does that make, what I mean? So the representative is right that we could do this, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's good. If that's a long way of saying Arizona is a really hot place right now politically and was really intense in this last election. And that's because they are competitive, so competition doesn't always breed good, like there's problems when we have super competitive districts as well. So
yeah, no, and I've heard that before also. So that's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
About commissions, before we get specifically to Utah's, there were some states that had some successful commissions this year, and there were
That's
some that had some commissions that crashed and burned. So talk about the role of commissions in this process and what a successful commission would look like, and if you think they're, again, if they're good for democracy.
Yeah, I love that. I love you keep asking that question. I feel like, yeah. So what we have is a situation that states across, Constitution says how we're going to run elections is dictated by the states. So we have 50 different versions of this. Okay. Most of our states use the state legislature doing it because that's just the easiest way to do it. And it's the way they've all done it. Does that make sense? So like for the most part, most states in the union have the state legislature making the choice. And what's weird is if you look at the National Conference of State Legislatures data on which states use commissions, Utah doesn't show up. And the reason it doesn't show up is because our commission has no authority. So the commission that we designed is, and I hate to say this, oh my gosh, as I say this, basically window dressing. Does that make sense? So it is a group of people who did an excellent job and did a lot of hard work and had zero ability to implement what they were doing. In states like California, Arizona, Pennsylvania, that I was just talking about, the commissions are in charge. So in those states, but it's funny the way you ask whether it's successful, right? If you're a Republican in Arizona, you're going to go, no, that was totally unfair. They gerrymandered it and they made it easier for Democrats to win. And that wasn't okay. For California, the conversation around the commissions and the community of interest and the lobbying, the political games afoot. Oh my goodness. I mean, just the stories around how those lines got drawn doesn't sound, you know what I'm trying to say? Like,
so even an independent commission can be politicized.
Oh my gosh. Well, they are. I mean, what I was trying to say to people is like, I would have to go to Maine and draw their districts, right? Why you needed someone like who totally has no idea of the political. So I loved it about our commissioners. And I was on a panel with a representative from our commission back in the fall. And they're like, we are totally not taking into account the politics. And I was thinking, yes, I mean, I know that you say that, but you live here. So you know that the Democrats live in Salt Lake County and Summit County. I mean, like, the only way you could totally depoliticize, honestly, would probably be bringing someone from like France, right? Like, and have them just draw the districts based on math, because we're human. And anyone interested in politics knows the politics of the areas that they are in, right? So yeah, the commissions, even when they are supposed to be apolitical, they're political. And what happened in California, and I don't have evidence of this happening in Utah, so I want to be clear, I'm not saying this here, but in California, lobbyists were hired to show up at those public meetings, right? So interest groups would say, I'm paying you, go and stand and make a statement, right? So they would, and we call that like AstroTurf, right? Politics, where it looks like it's grassroots, but actually it's fake grass, because what I've done is pay people to go. You know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff happens. So even when I'm doing my due diligence and I'm being totally apolitical, politics comes in. Yeah, right. So, in a couple of our states, the commissions advise. So I picked on Maine, like that's a state that has an advisory commission where maybe the legislature has to listen to it. And then in a few states, it's if the legislature fails to meet the filing deadline, then the commission kicks in. But again, in answer to your question, they crash and burn when they look like they're being unfair. And the thing is, not everyone understands all of the rules. And I would argue elected officials don't always understand all of the rules. And so things look really unfair, but you're like, but that's constitutional. Like I have to do it that way. I can't do a donut. Do you know what I mean? Like, so those kind of things start to happen. But yeah, but no, politics sneak in everywhere.
Going back to congressional maps, and we don't have census data yet to prove that people have moved, but there's a lot of anecdotal data that people have moved from their normal political environment in this time. Do you foresee that making changes in the electorate in the next 9 years, I guess, 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If I were thinking about Utah specifically, I think the way you get political change is going to be migration. Yeah. So your question, I think inside of that question is,
Yeah.
can I work in California and live in Utah? Right? Do you know what I mean? So I'm going to bring my politics with me. And I do think we should see the effects of that. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, we haven't seen it yet, but I do think over the next decade, we could possibly see it. So as this country figures out that migration is possible, and work is not necessarily place-based, right? And then people can now kind of live very different places. But in counter to that, again, is kind of the sociological dynamic of the fact that like Democrats like to live in cities in a way that Republicans don't. Do you know what I mean? Like, so
it sounded really good to go live up in the mountains during a pandemic, but once the pandemic's over, are you going to want to live full time at your mountain house, or are you going to go back to symphonies and operas and ballets every weekend?
And not driving everywhere I go, right? So
And
think
not
about
driving.
the people, right, who are choosing to live a walking only, I don't want to say walking, but in walking communities. I mean, if you think about who those people are and how they vote, right? Like, I'm not sure about this, but I think it is very possible that we will get some more blend that we haven't seen before, given the disruption to our economy. Yeah, right. And generally, disruptions like COVID and things we learn from those disruptions are what drives major change in our country. And historically, I'm not sure we'd know that till like 2028. You know what I mean? Like, until we kind of see it. But I think it's possible. Yeah.
So I have a couple more questions, but we're getting some questions in the chat. So I want to look at those and make sure that we answer some of these questions. So Ann O'Connell says, what do you think of proportional representation?
I think it's not. Okay, so let's do this real quick. Okay, so the United States Constitution requires that we have at the national level geographic representation, not proportional representation. So it would be difficult for states to do proportional representation while the national level does geographic. So I'll just like introduce an example to kind of explain this. 23 states in the, 23 cities in the state of Utah switched to ranked choice voting for this election cycle. It's fine. People have used ranked choice voting. New York City switched to ranked choice voting. And we did some like surveys out of the Walker Institute about how people felt about it. And a lot of people were like, it's invalid. And the reason it's invalid is because we've never done it this way before. So even though ranked choice voting is a totally valid, feasible, interesting way to choose, because we always do winner take all, we have a really hard time trying something new. All right, so states could absolutely introduce proportional representation, right? So the state of Utah could say, these are the groups we're going to say you have to have in the state legislature. And basically, for those of you who don't know, proportional representation is group representation rather than geographic representation. So what you would do, like so in Israel, for example, they'll say, if 50% of the population voted Democratic, then half the legislature is Democratic, no matter what, right? Like so, and what the parties do is they give you a list of names. And after the election results come in, Israel goes, all right, Democrats get 12, Republicans get 5, you know, like libertarians get 4, whatever. And proportional representation is very good for getting multi-party systems because what happens is there's a prize for 10th place. So you get a lot more parties because I can be in this and be viable and not win. For us, when we at the national level use geographic representation, which means our units, our political units are states and districts. And we have done that since the colonies, right? We've just always done it that way. Then you get it's plurality-based system. So it's whoever wins the most gets that geographic unit. Really hard to have more than 2 viable parties, really impossible to have more than 2 viable parties. So the state of Utah could go, no, what we're gonna do is we're gonna say our state legislature runs proportionally. So we're gonna say if 34% of the state votes Democratic, then 34% of the state legislature is a Democrat, but it would look so weird. Does that mean like it would be really hard for voters in the state to like get their mind around how different that is compared to what's happening in the nation. So proportional representation has its benefits, right? It's a different way of doing things. It's as valid as our plurality system and our geographic unit. It tends to promote a diversity of party platforms because, again, you can win nothing and still be like in the legislature, which is a good thing. But it'd be a hard sell in this country. Does that make sense? Like path dependence would make that really hard for any state to actually embrace it and people to do okay. However, Orem's doing ranked choice voting. So right, like maybe it's the case that Utah will be innovative and try something new. But I don't think so. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Yeah.
Fair enough. Catherine Fitzgerald says, how would you define a good democracy? What characteristics would it have? And is it feasible in this country?
Oh, this is such a good question. And everyone is talking about this right now. And I think I'm going to give you an answer that you don't like, right? So for me, a good democracy is when citizens are engaged. So to a certain extent, even though earlier I said, wow, we're all tired, we are doing really good democracy right now. Our voter turnout was the highest it ever was. Our state had turnout in the 60%, right? I mean, like 90% of our registered voters voted in the 2020 election. That's a good characteristic, right? That is people who care. But man, we're loud and mean as we do it, right? So inside of your question, I think is, do I think it's feasible? Yes. I wish democracy, as a concept, like, big D democracy, right? Like if I were kind of defining what that looks like, is an active and engaged citizenry that has respect for each other's human dignity. And I don't think we have that right now. And the problem that I have is maybe the more engaged we are, the more passionate we are, the less capable we are of actually not being hostile to each other. And so then maybe it's not feasible to have all that I want. So I was sharing this data today with my students. In 1960, we asked Americans, in a Gallup survey poll, would you be displeased if your child married someone from another party? 5% of Americans said, yeah, I'd be displeased. I'm a Republican. If they marry a Democrat, that would be a problem. In 2010, it was 40%, right? Because we're like, don't bring someone from the other party into my house. I do not want those people at my Thanksgiving dinner. That was 2010. If we measured it in 2020, I bet it's even higher. So again, good democracy. We're really engaged. We're all really active and we're angry all the time. And so we're hostile to people who are not in our party. So what I want is a democracy where we're engaged and we're active and we're not angry. And I actually am not sure that is feasible. Does that make and I don't think that's about our country. I think it's more about the human condition. Right? What makes us passionate might be anger, but yeah.
That gets back to the better angels again.
Oh my goodness. Yes. Yeah.
So
go ahead.
Along those thought lines, and this isn't just a debate in Utah, it's a nationwide of freedom of association. I think some Republicans especially call it that, with the caucus convention system as opposed to open primaries. So I think a lot of Republicans feel like that caucus convention system keeps the people that are really politically active and charged as the primary decision makers, as opposed to open primaries where anybody can participate. Right. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I want to just be clear. Republicans think whatever helps them win is a better idea. Democrats think whatever helps them win is a better idea. Democrats invented caucuses in this country. So the first time we had caucuses and parties making those choices and using conventions were Democrats in the 1800s. As the Democratic Party, which historically has been the party of groups and immigrants, does that make sense? Like that's just been true. So like one of my favorite historical things to tell students were like, Thomas Jefferson says to Aaron Burr, go down to the harbor and find those immigrants and sign them up for our party, right? Like that's the Democratic Party really early doing that. As a result, the Democrats tend to be the party of people who can't make it to a caucus. So they land on primaries as being a better way of doing things because it's more possible for their voter demographic to be engaged. Republicans tend to have in their demographic base people who can show up on a Tuesday or a Thursday night and go to a caucus. Right. So when they're thinking about it, they're like, our people are here. This is a really good idea. So when you have it with the parties, I just want to be clear. I don't think it's super like divorced from who's in their groups. Does that make sense? Like both parties going to be pushing those types of systems to nominate based on who is in their group. But when we get out of the party and like who's in the demographic base, the thing about caucuses is you can go and have your voice heard if you show up, right? So for those people, that's very powerful. I always like to tell, if you ever watch Gilmore Girls, it's like going to a meeting in a barn, right? You're having a conversation, and the efficacy that people feel and the connection they feel to their government and how they feel like the country is theirs, all of those are real things out of caucus convention systems, but they're only real things for the people who show up, if that makes sense, right? When we have primaries, we get more people showing up, but a little less of that, I don't know, civic attachment. Does that make sense? Because it's a little more, I'm just kind of showing up and I'm voting. And in our state, I'm not even showing up. They mail me the ballot, right? I'm gonna like mail it back. So when we think about associational democracy, and we think about the ways that we want citizens to see each other and work together and learn to compromise and hear each other, to a certain extent, caucus convention does that better for us than primaries do. Because I can vote in a primary, even if it's not vote by mail, I just stand in a long line with my AirPods in, I don't talk to anybody, and I just click a button and walk out. But a caucus requires me to talk to people, if that makes sense. So I think there are benefits to both, and there's costs to using each system. But I'm always very thoughtful about, there's something really fun about a group of people in a gym having a conversation about politics, you know what I mean? For associational democracy. There's also something really fun about 60% of people actually getting to go. Do you know what I mean? Like, so it's, and again, when we think about, is it feasible? I want everyone active and engaged, and I want it to be caucuses, and that's probably not plausible, right? Like that's probably not feasible, because if I had 2 million people show up at caucuses, it would break the system. You know what I mean? But generally in our state, so I think for the parties, because that's what you asked, was that partisan question, Republicans tend to be people who can go to caucuses more than Democrats are. And that's not just in Utah, like that's across the country. And so generally Democrats are going to land on primary as a better tool because more of their people are engaged. And I think that makes sense. So.
Thank you. We've gotten completely off redistricting,
and that's okay.
Totally okay. Ann O'Connell asks, is not the US Senate a huge barrier to national decision making and has been for most of our history?
Yes.
Not a, you know.
It is a huge barrier, and it has been for 230 some years, and it's supposed to be. That's a horrible end to that. But so again, what Hamilton's going to be like, take it out of the hands of the people because they're crazy, right? We're going to move everything into the hands of experts and you just go away. I always tell this, like George Washington would say, you elected me, I'll see you in 4 years. Don't even write me a letter. Don't talk to me. I'm doing my job. If you don't like it, vote for someone else. It's a very detached, aloof style of governing, not democratic, small d democratic, like at all. And the Senate is the model for that. Okay, so when we think about the chambers and the branches and how we designed this whole thing, well, the Supreme Court's the best model of it. Does that make sense? So the idea is those people you don't even meet. Like you have no idea who they are, right? They're just in there. You don't even know what they do. If you went to the Supreme Court building, you can go in for 2 minutes and then they kick you out. Congress, at least everything's on the record and is public, right? So you can actually see what they are doing. But the Senate is designed to slow everything down. So you were talking earlier about staggered terms in our state legislature. The Senate has staggered terms, or only a third of them are elected at any given time, and very much designed. So the idea is everything, all hell breaks loose and we elect out 100% of the people that we can, there will still be 67 people who were there last year. And that's designed to be a stabilizing effect. It's designed to undemocratize, right? So they're like, if you are having this passionate impulse, we need someone to slow you down, and the Senate's designed to do that. It's very frustrating, but that's its job.
That's its job. There you go.
Yeah.
Helen Moser asks, what is the likelihood that a third party can break the political stalemate we have in Utah or our nation?
Yeah, so the answer is slim to none. So there's only one time. So again, we talked about this earlier. We have a geographic political system, which means we have one winner. So we look at District 2, and District 2 gets one person. And as a result, it's a plurality. So I could win District 2 with 20%, as long as everyone else comes in under 20%, right? You don't have to have a majority in Utah. States like Louisiana, Georgia, you have to have a majority. So those states actually require 51%, but it's still one person that we are sending. As a result, there is no political incentive for someone to not be a Democrat or a Republican. I'm never going to win, right? If I'm going to win, I got to be in one of the major viable parties. In our history, parties have disappeared. So the Republican Party started as a third party in the 1850s in Wisconsin, and it knocks the Whigs out. And it does so as a result of a disruption like the Civil War, right? So basically, and slavery and that issue. So it is possible that we would have a major disruption like we did in 1860 that causes the whole political system to shake, and one of our major parties just doesn't pay attention. Do you know what I mean? So I think it is possible that one of our major parties does not adapt well, and I could see that happening, but I don't think it's likely. Does that make sense? Like, I think what happens is, as the system does that, where the disruption happens, both parties pay attention and then they adapt in an effort to try to win, and they're pretty good at trying to win. So I just don't see it breaking that stalemate. So what's interesting in the numbers is we've got, like, you know, a little bit more than a third Democrats, a little bit less than a third Republican, and about a third independent is the numbers that you'll see. But when you ask those independents how they voted, right? And this is my favorite in Utah. When I got here, 76% of people in Utah said they were independent. I was like, what? They vote Republican all the time. But okay, so you ask an independent, like, how do you vote? Once that happens, we actually only have 10% real independence. So of that third that's independent, most of them vote consistently one party or the other. So you're kind of like, well, you say you're independent, but you vote like a Democrat, right? Like, you say you're independent and you vote like a Republican. And we really only have 10% of people who are flipping, and that's not a lot. Does that make sense? So to have a break in the stalemate, we would need more of that third to be inconsistent, if that makes sense. Like, we need them to be voting, flipping a lot more to be able to see room for a third party to come on in here.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one more, well, maybe two questions before we get back to the final part for redistricting. Catherine Bealey asks, Congress members can run in any district they want without having to live there, but voters must vote in the district where they live. Why can't we create a voting system in which voters can weigh in on all the congressional candidates?
Yeah, so that is an interesting question. So let's kind of, and state law dictates that. So if you went back to when we were choosing House members at the beginning, all of the House districts, so like Utah's got 4, I'll just pick on Utah. All 4 of them could come from the same street. Like, so basically it was the state of Utah sending 4, and all 4 of them could come from the same street. In the mid 1800s, Congress began to say, you should use districts. And the political will for that came from states that were using districts. And then that starts to boil down. And then the Supreme Court kind of doubles down on one person, one vote, right? The districts have to look this way. And we get real strict about districts for voting. But we do not ever get real strict about running. And the reason why is the Article 1 for the United States House, and even the Senate, says inhabitant, not resident. All right, so I want to be clear. Article 2 for the president says you have to be a resident for 14 years. So if you want to run for president, you have to have lived in this country for 14 years, resided here. Article 1 says inhabitant. So basically what that means is you could just own property. Do you hear them? Like, you know what I mean? So my family owns property in Elise Stefanik's district in New York State. I'm like, I should run against her. I'll just do that. And I could, right? Like I probably have to like pay some taxes there, like before it became real reasonable. But I could, because technically, does that make sense? If I own property there and I paid property taxes there, I'm an inhabitant of the state of New York and I'm an inhabitant of that district. And so I'm allowed. So to change this, to make this tighter would require a constitutional amendment to change that language in Article 1. So that's why. But the rules on voting, driven by state law and Supreme Court case law, are a lot much tighter, if that makes sense.
Thank you. So last generic question, which is completely open-ended. Catherine Fitzgerald says, what hope do you see for our system?
Oh, so today I had a conversation with someone. The hope that I see, so I'll just share as a political science professor, and I'm working every semester with hundreds of young people. That's the hope I see. So I'll just give you a very specific example. I told you we're super polarized, we're not super nice to each other, and we're very hostile. And so in an effort to fix that, one of my things I make my students do is they get into Zoom conversations like this with a total stranger, thousands of college students from across the country, from dozens of campuses, and they have to talk about politics for an hour. And they do it. And they don't complain, and then they wrote beautiful papers about how they were different from these people and that it was okay, and like talking about how political diversity was cool and how great it was to meet people from outside of Utah and how different they were. And I was like, oh no, we're going to be okay. Right? I think there's a lot of profit in this country right now around the meanness and the anger. And I think media makes profit off of it. And I think most of our elected officials profit off of that, politically profit off of that. But then there's like lovely people like Blake Moore, who's not that mean. Right? So you're seeing examples, of people, and I'm picking on Blake Moore, but like we're actually, I see hope in people who are reacting to the system and thinking it's probably not okay. And I see hope in our young people who kind of get it, that we're all human and we can have these conversations without screaming at each other. Now, again, those are my students, right? And but I've got hundreds of them and they all did a good job. So that's where I see the hope.
Excellent. Thank you. So voters passed Prop 4 to create an independent redistricting commission, and then their work was ignored by the legislature, as was constitutional in the state of Utah. Are there any laws that you think could be passed in the next 9 years to make the redistricting process better in Utah next time?
Yeah, the answer is you'd have to have, well, again, so you asked that with the better. So I'm just going to say, in the states where we have commissions, it's not necessarily better or more fair, right? And hijinks ensue. Right? So anytime you have humans making decisions about politics, hijinks ensue. But I think if we feel like we don't want the state legislature making the decisions, and I'm not sure that I disagree with that sentiment. Does that make sense? Like, I think I might be with Hamilton, that the more we have commissions and experts, maybe the better that it is. Then what we need is an initiative that makes it have authority. So the commission had no authority. You need to have governing authority to be able to make that change, right? So the answer is the state legislature passes a bill that gives the authority away, which I don't really see happening, or we pass an initiative that gives teeth to that commission.
Are there any tweaks around the edges outside of that minor change that you think could make anything better? No.
No. So the answer is you've got to have authority to tell the legislature what to do. Otherwise, they will ignore you. And they can, right? Like, you know what I mean? So, right. So they can't ignore the Supreme Court. right? So they can't draw districts that are just crazy. Do you know what I mean? They have to actually abide by the rules the Supreme Court of the United States lays out, but they can ignore you and me. Do you know what I mean? To the, you know, and if we're really angry about it, we need to not vote for them again.
So outside of the state level, is there hope for national voting rights legislation? There's obviously a few bills that are held up in the Senate right now. What do you think the chances of any of those or an alternate version of any of those passing is?
Yeah, so I think, again, like to go back to that, the Senate's a problem, right? Like so the Senate is slowing this down. I think the Republicans have zero political incentive right now to compromise, because I think they think they're going to wipe the floor with the Democrats in the next election. So if I were a Republican, I would just stall. So at this point, I'd be stalling till November. So I don't think, not even just voting rights, I don't think anything gets done in this Congress, because it looks like the Republicans are going to win in November. So if you're the Republican Party, you have no reason to play. Does that make sense? Like there's absolutely no reason to compromise. So they're just not going to do it. And the thing around voting rights, what would make the change is if the Republicans realize that some of these tight voting rules hurts their voters as well, right? So, and I actually think it does. The people who were voting for President Trump were new voters, right? Like to the system, and they had a hard time navigating all the rules. So to see change on this, we would need Republicans to see that they would get a political benefit from having voting rights legislation that made it easier for voters to vote. But old conventional wisdom, okay, so old knowledge is if the Republicans want to win, they need voters to be harder to vote because their people can show up. If the Democrats want to win, just like we talked about with the primary and the caucus, the demographic basis, they need it to be as easy as possible so they can get more people into the system. But I think that's old, and I don't think it reflects changing demographics in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. So I actually think you might see some movement on that as the Republicans figure out who their voters are.
So not this year, but maybe by the time the next redistricting process comes around, there could be national legislation around.
Yep. Yeah. The more that, yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah. Okay. But, right. When we think about, so no, I'll say more. The voters that we saw migrating to President Trump, driving a change in the Republican Party, tended to be white working class voters. So they are what we would have thought were Democrats 20 years ago. They would have voted for Bill Clinton. Does that make sense? So if that is going to become part of the core of the Republican Party, then they will move on voting rights legislation and make it easier for those people to vote. And that will help across the board with voting rights. So, but I don't think they see it yet. Does that make sense? And I don't think they know if it's a new core or if it's just Trump voters, right? So I think I think there'll be a little bit of, as that party figures that out.
So last question is a little wonky on my part.
Okay.
So with the census this time, the census reported numbers using something called differential privacy instead of swapping. So to statutorily protect the identity of voters, they used to do something called swapping, which they would just move a Black person, in an all white county into the next county over. This time they used differential privacy, which fuzzed all of the numbers. So all of our numbers for all of our districts were off by about 10 to 15%. There's currently a lawsuit against the Census Bureau because they are constitutionally required to count all people.
Right.
So if the states, including Utah, who sue the Census Bureau, win that lawsuit and the Census Bureau has to deliver new census numbers to the state, do you think there would be a will by the legislature to redraw these maps?
I think it depends on who wins. So again, we'll make that really clear. By the way, so you can redistrict anytime. So states could redistrict every year, right? So they could draw districts all the time. You don't have to do it just after the census. But it is so traumatic, like it's so angst ridden that they just don't do it that often. But if something happens in the districts that they draw that they don't like, and there's political will to change it, does that make sense? Then they will change it, whether the census whether they win the lawsuit against the census or not. But I think having new data would give them a really reasonable reason to redraw if they wanted to. So there would be more will in that case, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Murray, for joining us tonight. That was excellent. I know that got a little off of redistricting topic, but I think that was all fantastic. So we really appreciate you showing up.
No, of course. And I think that redistricting is a conversation around representation. And everything we talked about was about representation, right? And how we choose who represents us, so the same concepts around whether it's primary versus caucus, right? Whether we pack or we crack our power bases, it is the same. To me, it's the same concept that we're talking about, right? To what extent are we being fair, and to what people are we being fair, and that there are problems in all of them, how we do these things. So I appreciate the conversation very much, and I'm sorry that I don't know deep dives on some of the districts the way you're asking. I apologize for that. So.
No worries.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.